Bill Goldberg doesn't necessarily have the reputation of being the best worker, so to speak. But what if I told you that there was a method out there that I think is relatively easy to produce and relatively safe, and it brings out the best in wrestlers just like Goldberg? And that it's a strategy that I feel a lot of fans and also some wrestlers could really use a reminder of. Well, that is the exact topic of this episode, because today... A big thank you to my supporters over on Patreon, such as Dakari Garmin, Mr. J, Ron Hawthorne, Mangy Stray, Harry Flynn, and The Reflection of Perfection. Thank you so much for all the help. It really does mean a lot. Alright, so for this episode, we're really only going to be focusing on one very specific part of a wrestling match. However, this does speak volumes if you realize that it's all about the concept, the mentality instead. But that is the hardest part for a lot of people to get down, as simple step-by-step instructions are easy to copy, but incorporating a new way of thinking, on the other hand, is much harder for people to do. But in this case, it's the mentality that's everything. Anyway, let's start getting into the episode by starting with, well, the beginning of Bill Goldberg. Now, Goldberg was not a wrestling fan himself per se, and after his NFL career wrapped up, he found himself training in the WCW power plant, after being convinced to give pro wrestling a try thanks to Lex Luger and Sting. But surprisingly, it didn't take very long before he got himself into the ring, as it happened only after a few months. Now, this does make sense, since for whatever reason, WCW had a thing for professional football players, such as Kevin Green and Mongo McMichael. But on top of that, Bill does have a great look, and he has a lot of natural charisma. And with that being said, it's not all that surprising that one of Goldberg's first feuds was against Mongo McMichael himself. And interestingly enough, his program with Steve Mongo McMichael led to him having his first match over 5 minutes. That's right, contrary to popular belief, Bill Goldberg's bout against William Regal was not his first to go the distance. Or over 300 seconds, shall I say. Now don't get it twisted, this match was not an Iron Man bout, as it only lasted about 6 minutes and 30 seconds. And in terms of Bill's other matches up until this point, well, he served up more squash than a farmer's market, defeating the Barbarian in 3 minutes and 11 seconds, beating Wrath in 20 seconds, even Glacier at a minute held out longer than that. But let's also remember that good old Barry Horowitz clocked in at 16. Moving forward, and as the story goes, and as I covered previously on this channel, Bill Goldberg would have a match against one Steven Regal, where allegedly Regal was told to have a competitive match that went over 5 minutes with Big Bill. And what ensued was interesting to say the least, as Regal can be seen trying to bring the best out of him, but at the same time, Goldberg recounts the events differently. Again, I've already covered this. But this right here does bring up a very interesting point. How do you bring out the best and most competitive match out of someone, especially someone who's green to the industry? Well, you see, there are several approaches to this matter. For one, let's talk about Goldberg's specific deficiencies. As someone who wasn't really trained all that much, they don't have a lot of experience, but one of the bigger issues is that of cardio. Now again, I have talked about this before, but some lessons do bear repeating. And in terms of wrestling conditioning, this is one of the most important factors when it comes to putting on a good match, whether it's amateur or professional wrestling. To paraphrase Daniel Bryan, you can spend 5 hours on a treadmill and be completely fine, but then do 5 minutes in the ring and be completely blown out. Why is that? Well, it's because wrestling requires a much greater level of conditioning, as not only are you using muscles in very different ways, but also you're getting slammed onto the mat, having all the air pushed out of your lungs, which also happens when you do something simple like running the ropes. So your recovery time and your stamina have much greater requirements. And not only that, but it's one thing to be able to do wrestling moves when you're completely rested, it's another thing to be able to do them when you're exhausted. And that is where safety comes into play, because a lot of people tend to make mistakes when they're gassed. And if you recall, professional football player Lawrence Taylor said that professional wrestling was one of the most exhausting things he's ever been put through, after having his main event match with Bam Bam Bigelow at WrestleMania 11, thus proving that it really doesn't matter how good you are at football, it doesn't mean you're gonna make a great pro wrestler. So anyway, in order for someone to have a competitive bout that looks good, there are several things you could do to make this happen. Number one, you could train them properly and wait to see if they're ready before you let them have a match. But since that's not the case with Goldberg, you can also try really hard to cover it up. But how do you do that? Well, one thing you could do is you could have them have really short matches, that way the audience never gets to find out if they're gassed. And obviously enough, this was primarily the strategy WCW used with Goldberg. But audiences will eventually get tired of seeing this all the time, so you gotta mix it up a little bit. And so, another way you can try to camouflage things is to have a seasoned veteran, someone who really knows what they're doing, try and carry them throughout the bout. And depending on whose side you believe, that might have been the goal with Steven Regal. However, didn't really work now, did it? But now, if relying on one heck of a hand to carry him isn't gonna work, then what else can you do? Well, you can always rely on that of theatrics. Let's go on to another one of his over 5-minute bouts. Let's look at Spring Stampede in 1998, which lasted over 8 minutes, and it featured Goldberg going against one Perry Saturn, prepping him for his United States title fight that he was going to have against Raven the following night on Nitro. Now, this match was nothing spectacular, but one thing that WCW needed to do was to have a lot of run-ins and interference to really pad the time. And also, let's remember that just like with Regal, Saturn is also another consummate professional that did as best as he could to try and carry Goldberg through the bout. And so, while Goldberg did have other attempts at going over 5 minutes, again repeating his matches with Perry Saturn and Mongo McMichael, none of these have remained too memorable. But Goldberg would have one major bout, and that's the one that I think changes everything, and it's one employing the exact strategy that I'm talking about today. And that match was against none other than Hollywood Hulk Hogan, clocking in at 8 minutes and 11 seconds. And of course, it was for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship, where Goldberg was victorious. As the story goes, according to one Eric Bischoff, Hulk Hogan called up Eazy-E and said that he wanted a match with Goldberg and he was gonna put him over. Now, as much as people don't like Hulk Hogan nowadays, he's still an absolute master at ring psychology, and he always knew how to get the best out of people when he really put his mind to it. And in the case of Big Bill, it seems like Hogan really knew how to crack the code. Now, I'm not trying to say that Hulk Hogan invented this method or was he the first to do it. I'm just trying to say that he was the one who did it the best, especially against Goldberg. Now, we should be clear about this. Hogan in no way, shape, or form is known as being a technical master, even though he was way more technical in Japan. And also, Hogan also has a tendency to work better with bigger guys, and not so much the smaller ones. Now, in my opinion, it was Hulk Hogan who was the first person to be able to put on a really good match with Goldberg, and he did so right from the start. If you look at the beginning of their World Heavyweight Championship bout, you notice that one of the first things that happens is Hulk Hogan and Goldberg lock horns in a classic collar and elbow tie-up, only for Hogan to get shoved right to the ground. Now look, right here at the look on Hulk Hogan's face. The Hulkster is terrified, and right here, this simple move means everything because it's all about the psychology behind it. Now let's look at another one of Bill Goldberg's more revered matches, such as his Halloween Havoc match against DDP. And right from the beginning, Goldberg collar and elbow tie-up with Diamond Dallas Page, only to shove Page right off. However, this time, after DDP goes flying, he comes back for more, only to get shoved off yet again. So this time, it plays more into the tenacity of Diamond Dallas Page, featuring more of his assets. Alright, let's look at another one. This time, it's Backlash 2003 with Goldberg facing off against The Rock. Now, we just saw the showmanship of Hulk Hogan, and we just saw the agility of Diamond Dallas Page, WCW's People's Champion. But what about WWE's? Well, here we have The Rock doing both as he flips completely out of the ring, all off of one shove. Now that is selling. This is what it's all about. A simple collar and elbow tie-up. This may lead to another simple move like a standing side headlock or another collar and elbow tie-up, but then either way, Goldberg shows and the other wrestler sells it like $1,000,000. And to be clear, by selling, we're not always talking about acting like you got shot, as you can sell deeply with emotions, a concept that has been so overlooked these days. This is not complicated and it's not remotely technical, and it's relatively safe as there's not a lot of room for injury. But yet it speaks absolute volumes, because it's not about the move itself, it's what you do with it. Hogan looks absolutely petrified as he's trying to ruminate what just happened as this guy shoved him off like he was nothing. And Diamond Dallas Page, on the other hand, after trying and getting shoved off 3 times by Goldberg, the look of desperation set in on DDP. You can see it in his whole body. And The Rock, well, he's being The Rock. This simple maneuver, when done right, always leads to a big reaction from the crowd, And not only that, but about 20 years later, Brock Lesnar would repeat it himself. And it still works even against a near 50-year-old Goldberg. They say that most of acting is actually reacting, and this is something I feel like a lot of people forget about, is it's your reactions that make everything matter. If you can convince me with your facial expressions and your body language that this guy is an absolute tank, I'm going to believe you. And nobody knew that better than Hogan, as he adapted a lot of his style from a lot of great sources. And let's also remember that as a babyface, Hogan was one of the absolute best at getting sympathy. Even though he stood at 6'7" and almost 300 pounds, somehow you were afraid for him when he went against the Macho Man, who was about half a foot shorter than him and 50 pounds lighter. But yet you bought it, and he had the fans eating out of the palm of his hand. And then, when he turned heel, he was able to take his ability to gain sympathy and turn it the other way around, making the baby faces that he fought seem all the more intimidating. And while I have some appreciation for some of the other techniques that were used to try and carry Goldberg through a match, they did have their shortcomings. As you shouldn't try to drag Goldberg into a technical bout making him do moves that he has no idea how to do, as that's just gonna end badly. But also, you shouldn't go on the offense, as it puts too much of the selling responsibility on Goldberg, which is something else that he seems to be inept in. And this does mean that 100% of the sells have to be on you, but you gotta do it, and you gotta compensate for how much he's lacking. Like with Glacier here. Yeah, he starts off in the collar and elbow tie, but no reaction whatsoever that anything just happened. And so, my point is, when it comes to being a master strategist of the kayfabe world, you have to understand that the better your opponent looks, the better you look. And the best way to convey that is through selling, and not just talking about selling moves. Not just physical pain, but also emotional pain as well, as emotions are how we connect to each other as people. And when an audience is behind a wrestler, that's exactly when they can seem larger than life, as that's safe, it's simple, and it's effective. And I think we could all agree that professional wrestling could use a lot more of this kind of thinking instead of outside dives. Well, there you go, my thoughts on the Goldberg formula, but what are some other theatrics that you think do a lot for a professional wrestling match while still remaining safe? Let me know down in the comments, and please, you're subscribed to this channel, right? It's the Thinking Fans channel. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. Please give it a like, and thank you to all my wonderful Patreon supporters, and thank you for watching, and as always, Dave knows.